Yeah, I like for what it's worth, I like the Randall Kennedy precedent of like just brief introduction. We just don't, nobody needs like the whole over the top.
We can refer interested listeners to your websites and university pages. All right, so hello everyone. I'm Dustin Siebel. I'm a professor of political science at Michigan State University. And together with my colleague Arthur Melzer, I co-direct the LeFrak Forum. So welcome everyone to the second event of our conference and the first panel. This morning's panel is devoted to the question, what are the empirical facts about lack of intellectual diversity in academia? And what are the causes of existing imbalances? I'm just going to very briefly introduce our presenter and our discussants, and I'll go over the ground rules for participation, and then we'll dive right in. So Lee Jussim is Distinguished Professor and Chair at the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University, and he will be presenting today. Philip Tetlock is Annenberg University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He will be our first discussant. And Cory Clark, visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Psychology, will be our second discussant. So we'll start with Professor Jussim, and then we'll dive into the discussants. Those of you who are attending, if you'd like to participate, what you should do is you should use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom browser and enter your questions in text there. Don't use the chat or raise your hand. So Professor Jussim.
So Dustin, I'm going to need to make a request. So even though I have an entire hashtag on Twitter against academia, I am indelibly an academic, and so my whole talk is surrounded, based off of a PowerPoint presentation. So I need to be able to share the screen with everybody.
I think I can allow that. I'm going to make you a host.
I also have slides, so just FYI, that will be coming up too.
This is good to know.
Daniel, sorry, I did make all panelists able to share.
Oh, okay. So you can already do it, I suppose.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Here we go. In that case, can you all see that? All right. So here we go. I hope to fulfill the mission that you guys have gave me, but I'm probably going to also try to do a little more than that, and hopefully not too much more than that. So I absolutely will be presenting data and some analyses of the lack of intellectual diversity, really political diversity is what I'm going to focus on, although it has spillover effects, and its sort of downstream effects on the functioning of academia. That's really kind of the talk here. Okay, so let me do some, so just clarification stuff up front. Just so you know what I'm talking about. So left, it's a general term for anyone from center left, sort of in the US, Democrats, Europe, Labor, Social Democrats, all the way to far left extremists, radical Marxists, intersectionalists, and I would include critical race theorists and certain veins of political social justice. I'll just leave this up here for you to read. This is a description of sort of social justice as a political movement by Freddie DeBoer, a socialist, a sort of pretty far left education reformer. So this is why I include that in this list of, and social justice can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. Okay, so let's leave that there. Right, anyone from center right who votes mostly Republican to conservatives, all the way to actual fascists and white supremacists, whoops. Radicals, anybody on the extreme end of the spectrum. Activist is anybody who actively participates in trying to achieve their political goals with other people in some way. It's pretty much anyone who does anything other than just sit there by themselves and votes maybe. Okay, I'm just a couple of qualifiers up front so that the rest of this, I hope, is not too badly misinterpreted. Even though I will be focusing on the sort of rise of the authoritarian left in general and on campus, If you follow right-wing media, sometimes you see these sort of histrionic claims. I won't be making any of these claims. They won't be making them because they're not true. Colleges aren't overrun with radical students, burning things down. As far as I can tell, there's not really any indoctrination of students that's going on. There may be attempted. I can't tell whether it's not happening or it's happening and it's ineffective, but the evidence is that it's not functionally happening one way or another. Even though I will be presenting data on this sort of extreme left skew and radicalization of the faculty, even the faculty are not overwhelmingly radicals and activists. That would not be true to the data, and I won't be saying that. Okay. Just one more thing. I probably don't need to say this to this group, but it sort of just comes up all the time. Well, why aren't you talking about what right-wing radicals? Well, there certainly is a problem with right-wing radicalization. They constitute some of the gravest, in my opinion, threats to speech, academic freedom, and liberal democracy. But I'm not covering that for two reasons. It's already massively, academia is all over this. It's like to describe it as a cottage industry would be to understate the extent to which academia is already over this. Also, threats from the right, at least to the academy, come mostly from outside the university. So they're sort of different in kind than threats from within the university. And what I'll be talking about are ideological threats from inside the university, and those come almost entirely from the left. Okay, enough on the qualifiers. So the rest of the talk is in 4 parts. I'm going to be presenting 3 different models that they're not competing. They're different ways, I think, of elucidating the same patterns and phenomena, but 3 models of the radicalization of academia are sort of ways to think about it. Then I'll be presenting the data on the massive left skew, especially in the social sciences and humanities. I'll be spending some time on the recent blossoming of research on left-wing authoritarianism. I think that's all I'll say about that right now. And then I'll be linking that to what I see as the rise of left-wing authoritarianism in the academy. Okay, so those are the 4 parts of the talk. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to be presenting is this pyramid model of radicalization. What you can see on the left, I hope, this is just a screenshot from Google Scholar. If you enter something like pyramid model of radicalization, all sorts of stuff comes up. And the reason, well, and so there's all these different papers. They don't all say the exact same thing. I've tried to extract the core ideas here. So at the very top of the pyramid, you have harassment and violence. You have kind of the worst features or manifestations of radicalization. Now, those incidents are few and far between, right? I mean, right-wing radicals are not storming the Capitol every day. It's just, even on that day, it would be literally true to say that most protesters weren't violent. The ones who stormed the Capitol were, but that was not most of the people who were in the Capitol. Okay, so that's built, and the idea, and the reason you have a pyramid model is as you go down the pyramid, there are more and more people engaged in these activities. So, the actual harassment and violence is built on a larger base of support of people who provide a tangible support and assistance to those willing to engage in harassment and violence. That is built, people providing tangible support is built on sort of an intellectual and political sort of ideological rhetoric, justifying, vindicating, inciting, and inspiring that kind of activity, but without actually engaging in it. That is often built on inactive support. And what inactive support is, a lot of people kind of support this, but they're not really actively engaged in any obvious sense other than maybe talking to their friends and colleagues and stuff. And even that is built on an even larger base of people who, one way or another are quiet. Maybe they're not interested, maybe they're not sure what to think, maybe they're ambivalent, but they're certainly not opposing or resisting the radicalization, they're acquiescing in it. So that's the pyramid model. And then there's this model, which I actually recently came up with, really just over the last few weeks for purposes having nothing to do with this talk, It's designed to, what I call this the activist to academia to activism pipeline model. And so for reasons that I don't think are, that I don't fully understand, for some set of reasons, people who are on the left in general, but especially activists, radicals, and left-wing authoritarians, are particularly attracted to academia. So they self-select into academia. And once that happens, there are all sorts of downstream consequences. So this group is disproportionately involved in deciding who to promote and honor and denounce and harass and ostracize. They create the work environment for the rest of us to a large degree. And they're producing a disproportionate amount of scholarship, at least disproportionate to their representation in the population. And so all this then feeds into activist rhetoric, practices, and policies when the scholarship reflects to greater or lesser degree the dogmatic political axe grinding of radicals, activists, and authoritarians. It's given the camouflage and credibility of science through processes such as peer review. And what you see on the bottom there is the kind of rhetoric you'll often see when this kind of stuff is discussed. You know, hey, it's science, it's peer review, or you're some kind of science denier. I don't have to explain myself, educate yourself, blah, 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 which is built on actual peer-reviewed scholarship. Okay, so that's the pipeline model. This is Eric Kaufman's model about sort of the self-radicalizing nature of academia. It's a cyclical model. There's no beginning and end because it's a feedback system. I'll just start from the top. So somehow academia has become this sort of left, maybe even far left moral community that produces what he calls soft and hard authoritarianism. It's up there, I'm not going to read it. That has all sorts of chilling effects on the nature of academia, especially on politicized topics. This repels people who don't subscribe to that ideology because, like, who wants to work in this kind of environment? And that feeds back to, to sort of create this sort of moral political tribal bubble. So that's Kaufman's model. Again, these models are not, I don't see them as conflicting. They're kind of different ways of looking at the same set of processes. It's kind of interesting that all three are kind of out there. Okay, so let me change gears here a little bit. Models, blah, blah, blah. You know, anybody can draw a model. Nice story. Thank you very much. So let's talk about data. This is psychology. What the y-axis here is the ratio of either Democrats or Republicans or liberals to conservatives in psychology going back 100 years. What you can see here is that, you know, the first half of the 20th century, psychology was leaned a little bit left, but not dramatically so. You know, there's a big gap in the data, at least the data that we could find from like the 60s to like the late 90s, early 2000s. And then starting around 2000, you have this acceleration of, what you might call the exile or purge of the non-left from psychologies. So the final red dot is a ratio of about 14:1. I think it's actually worse than that. This is social psychology, my discipline. This paper came out a couple of years ago. When asked not their identity or party affiliation, when they're asked who they vote for in this survey, social psychologists voted for Obama 301-4. That's about a 99%, sort of when push comes to shove, which side of the spectrum do you lie on. They also had additional ways of measuring. All this stuff can be measured in lots of different ways. It's like, well, what about this one? What about that? Well, okay, we'll do some of that. So they had an index of political issues. What policies and do people prefer or stand for? And again, hardly any conservatives. The distribution is way, way left skewed. If you simply self-identity, do you identify as liberal conservative? Again, hardly ever any conservatives. So again, no matter how you do it, social psychology is way, way, way left skewed. Okay, so that's psychology. This is Honeycutt and Freeberg. They actually surveyed faculty at 4 California state universities across the disciplines. And they had so many disciplines, they actually broke them out into like what are often schools, the school of arts and sciences, school of business, and all this kind of stuff. The tall sort of dotted bars, those are all liberals. And what you can see at a glance, except for agriculture, which I found really interesting when I first discovered this paper, agriculture reflects the country, right? You know, the rural areas are way, way conservative, overwhelmingly voted for Trump and all this stuff. That's actually reflected in agricultural programs in the academy. All the other programs are way, way left in their representation. Okay, this is more data on the same topic. This is by Mitchell Langbert. And what he has examined, you can get like registration, party registration rolls, and he examined this at elite colleges. I think elite was operationally defined as you made like the top 100 of the US News and World Report. These are liberal arts colleges. And again, what's shown is the ratio of Democrats to Republicans. And down in engineering, it's kind of close. And everywhere else it goes from 5 to 1 to infinity. I mean, if you look down at anthropology and communications, there are no registered Republicans. I mean, I think what he's showing there is the number of people or something like that. But so it's just this, and the elite colleges are important because they lead the way. They are probably the leading edge of the academy. What happens there usually overflows to the rest of the academy. So it's very, very extreme there. This is just a news report about Cornell. 99.5% of the political donations go to the left. I mean, it's just, it's essentially 100%. Actually, Langbert and Sean Stevens examined that empirically. So what you see on the left is a survey of 12,000 faculty at these top-rated colleges and universities, that the overall disproportion in registration is about 8.5 to 1. But actually that probably underestimates the left-right skew. So what you see in the middle is the donations overall, kind of like Cornell, 95 to 1. But the most amusing and interesting thing to me, I don't know, I mean, I'm familiar with these data. The most interesting thing to me when I first discovered these data was the little histogram on the far right. Registered Republicans in the academy donate to the Democrats at a ratio of 4.6 to 1 compared to how much they donate to the Republicans. That is, they're donating 4 to 5 times as much money. Republicans in the academy are donating 4 to 5 times as much to the Democrats as they are to the Republicans. So, okay. Now, just for a point of comparison, you might wonder, well, how far left is the United States? And well, there's lots of data on this, but I really like the Hidden Tribes report because they really broke it down into different groups. The far left, their survey result puts it around 8%. If you include depends on how you count. If you add the entire bars, the purple, orange, and sort of greenish yellow bar, it's about 35%, something like that. That's consistent with other polls. But the far left is about 8%. And so, it does raise, well, how does this compare to the academy? Well, these are data from like 15 years ago. And about 40% of social science and humanities faculty, and these are important because these are the fields that are most likely to deal with politicized topics, about 40% or so, 45%, identify themselves as radicals, activists, or Marxists. So that is a very high number. This is a Kaufman's report that just came out, finds something very, very similar. In social sciences and humanities, nearly 40% identify themselves as activists, nearly 30% as very, very left. So this is a heavy skew compared to the rest of the country, for example. So are they really radicals? Well, they say they are. Are they really activists? Well, they say they are. How about authoritarians? And I'm making a stronger claim here that the academy finds itself having to confront this rise of left-wing authoritarianism within its ranks. So that's a very strong claim. And so, kind of requires having some data. But understanding the data first requires understanding what left-wing authoritarianism is. And this is complicated by the fact that many in the conventional social sciences, in psychology, sociology, political science, have claimed for most of the last 50 years that there is no left-wing authoritarianism in the democratic West. And I don't know whether they were right when they were making their claims and something has changed, or they were always wrong and never looked for it in the right places. I can't distinguish those, but it is clear that it is here now. So I'm going to go through some of that. There's been this great blossoming of work measuring and then assessing sort of correlates and things, attitudes, behaviors predicted by left-wing authoritarianism. So this was the first paper, at least in psychology. So I have, in each of these cases, let me be clear, I'm talking about authoritarianism as a psychological variable, as a social and psychological variable. I'm not talking about the government or laws or political parties. I'm talking about authoritarianism, sort of endorsement of authoritarianism beliefs, authoritarian beliefs and values on the left. Okay, so this is really the paper that broke this open as an area of study in this recently, and I would say the social sciences more generally, and they developed and validated this first questionnaire assessing left-wing authoritarianism, LWA for short. I use that for short all throughout. This paper is in press. It will be coming out soon. They followed on the heels of Conway, and I think spent a lot more time and effort doing sort of the hard statistical psychometric work necessary to develop a valid and reliable scale. And I'll be relying on this scale to a large extent for the rest of the talk. But there's also this paper, which came out fairly recently, that actually uses the Costello scale. And it actually compared right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism as predictors of support for sort of draconian responses to the pandemic. So I'm not going to be dealing with the right-wing side of it. Feel free to read the paper. It's all in there. It's actually quite interesting, but I will be talking about some of the left-wing authoritarian results. Okay. So these papers, despite their differences, converge like in ways that you would, if you have any understanding of what authoritarianism is, they converge on what you would think authoritarianism would be composed of. So one is political intolerance, and actually this was the great insight, in my opinion, on Conway's part, was that the psychology, at least, had long been led down a rabbit hole of thinking of authoritarianism as a politics-free personality construct, like the authoritarian personality. And it's just not that. And the reason it's not that is authoritarianism is directed at one's political enemies. That's not directed at your political allies. It's directed at your enemies. So, the one way you could criticize Stalin 80 years ago is by saying the country's not Stalinist enough. You are not going to be sent to the gulag for saying that. So the intolerance is directed at those one opposes. So there's no way to separate, this is Conway's point, there's really no way to separate authoritarianism from who the authoritarianism is directed towards. Okay, so there's political intolerance, dogmatism, social vigilantism. That is, the social vigilantism is attempts to impose one's views about supposedly moral conduct on other people. It's not just like, okay, this is my opinion, I don't like what you do. No, you can't behave like that. Then there's endorsement of censorship. And these are a couple of items from the Costello scale. Strong leaders should stamp out prejudice. Fox News should be prohibited. And then endorsement of aggression. The rich should be stripped of their belongings, and endorsement of and support for political violence. Which again, this is exactly what you would predict if somebody was psychologically authoritarian. That is, you're on the right, you're in the right, you're morally right. Some might say you're on the right side of history, and if you're not on the right side of history, get out of the way, or we'll take care of you. But that's kind of the psychology of it. And I do have a couple of, like, okay, so that's sort of what these measures are about. On the lower left, you can see these sort of memes that are sort of endorsing and inciting violence against the police. On the right, this was a common thing on Twitter. I hope you can see it. The couple on the left, this is after the election. The meme on the left was fairly popular in some circles, trying to heal the left-right divides. The couple, can have a good relationship and be friends, even though they're Democrats and Republicans. This was widely denounced in academic Twitter. Like, I mean, I'm only going to show the one here, but the one here captures the tone of the widespread denunciations of attempts to cross and heal the political divide. And you can read that for yourself: concentration camps, white supremacy, So to me, this is, it's an anecdotal evidence that reflects, this constitutes an example of exactly what you would predict if you believed there was left-wing authoritarianism going on in the academy. Okay, well, what about the real data? On the top here, Costello used their scale to, they simply correlated it with various measures of dogmatism and intellectual humility, the reverse, right? Intellectual arrogance, intolerance, especially for one's political enemies. And the common is, you think of prejudice as, and what social scientists often study are racial prejudice or gender bias or a bias against sexual minorities. So that's not who the targets are here, right? Because those are kind of allies of the left. The prejudice targets here would be religious minorities, Christian fundamentalists, Mormons, Catholics, right? The people who would be on the, or might be on the conservative side of the spectrum. And left-wing authoritarianism predicts prejudice towards those groups, as well as dogmatism. Okay, so that's that. This is a disturbing analysis of nationally representative data, showing that this is only results for white liberals, which turns out to be really interesting. Results are really quite different for racial and ethnic minorities. This is endorsement of government censorship by white liberals. That's what what you're seeing with the red histograms. Young white liberals, that endorsement is about 50%. But even among older liberals, it's about 30%. So you are having a large minority and maybe an upcoming majority of people on the left, at least white people on the left, saying the government should prevent people from engaging in hate speech. Okay. This comes up in lots of other ways. So Costello gave a scenario where the leader of a right-wing militia group was coming to speak in people's community and simply asked, should this person be allowed to speak? And, the support for the government banning this militia leader from speaking correlated between 0.3 and 0.5, depending on exactly how they did the analysis. And then there's a separate scale measuring this social vigilantism construct. People need to be told that their point of view is wrong. That also correlated, in the 0.3 range with left-wing authoritarianism. And the slides refer to R's, partial R's, and betas. Some of them are simple correlations, just bivariate correlations. But in many of the analyses, especially the ones reporting partial R's or betas, they're controlling for own ideology. So these are effects of or partial correlations or relationships of left-wing authoritarianism with this sort of censorious sort of beliefs and attitudes or support for violence over and above personal political identity or ideology. This is from the Manson paper, the COVID paper. And so these correlations also, again, betas after the controls, of 0.3 to 0.5. So these are pretty hefty relationships of all sorts of sort of, harsh draconian treatment of people who either to ensure that they go along with the pandemic regulations or punishment if they violate them. So reporting to the police, churches should undergo government surveillance, right to protest should be restricted, and so forth and so on. This is exactly what you would expect if left-wing authoritarianism was a real and genuinely intolerant construct. And then there was support of, it also correlates with support for political violence. So Costello and we didn't realize Costello included this when we were doing it. Our stuff, we just completed it. We asked, how much do you oppose or support the violent social justice protests? There was a paragraph explaining what we were talking about, including some images about the protests from summer 2020. Costello did something similar. And again, you get this sort of fairly substantial relationship between left-wing authoritarianism over and above personal political ideology or identity to support for violent protest. Okay. These are some additional results that I find disturbing. This is which, again, nationally representative data. I have the key thing circled. Among people who identify as very liberal, so reasonably construed as the far left, what's shown there is the proportion who feel it's what's shown is the proportion who feel it's never justified to use violence. So 2/3 in 2020, 2/3 of respondents on the far left say it's never justified to use violence to pursue political goals. What that means is 1/3 are saying it is sometimes justified to use political violence. And that's, the bluish purple bar is 2016. That is quite a change from 2016. And this might mean that for those last 50 years, when people were saying there was no left authoritarianism, they might have actually been right. This might be a recent phenomenon. But to me, this is a disturbingly high level of support for political violence on the far left. And one of my favorite things is when you see research, when you find out about some area of research, can you relate it to the real world? Can you see it manifesting in the real world? Now, that's subjective, it's anecdotal, blah, 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 blah. But any given study is some tiny sliver of life and social functioning. I, anyway, am more persuaded when I can think of actual examples that seem to reflect these processes. So, this is a blog I wrote that reported some of these data. And I think another way to think about this is to think about the difference between a culture of freedom and a culture of censoriousness. And what you see on the left are these anybody here, certainly anybody here, literally here at this conference, over 50 and probably over 40 will recognize the idioms and sayings on the left. This is like what we grew up with. It's a free country, sticks and stones may break my bones, different strokes for different folks. I mean, this is sort of, this was in the air, it was in the culture. And what we have now is really something quite different. Those idioms are not particularly popular, as far as I can tell. You don't really see them anymore. Instead, what you see is the stuff on the right. And you see a lot of the stuff on the right. And whatever substance there may be underlying the stuff on the right, it is pretty hard not to see all of it as having a strong vein of sit down and shut up. So I think pretty much anybody who pays attention can see this. Okay, so just to recap where I've been so far, you have massive left and radical overrepresentation in academia. Left-wing authoritarianism has these three main features: intolerance, support for censorship, and support for aggression. but that stops short of actually showing that there's left-wing authoritarian behavior in academia. So we have the massive left overrepresentation. The idea, I mean, this is highly plausible. Once you have a massive disproportion of people on the left, given any level of authoritarianism, it should be much higher in a group that is massively overrepresented by the left than in a representative sample of Americans. But of course, just because that is plausible and sounds like it might be true, that actually doesn't make it true. So let's look at some of the data. Okay, this data, these are examples. And this is an editorial that appeared in the Harvard Crimson, this is 2014, and I've circled the key idea. Let's give up on academic freedom in favor of justice. No, I mean, that's sort of, it doesn't get more authoritarian than that. That is what authoritarian is, enemies of freedom, right? Okay, so you have that. And then actually Randall talked about this yesterday. This is I'll leave it up here. You can read this. This is the text from the Princeton letter calling for a committee to oversee behavior, incidents, research, and publication that this committee would deem racist. And I'm referring this to the Ministry of Love because this comes right out of 1984. Okay. I have this list that's on the Medium. Anybody can find this. The threat to academic freedom from academics. It actually starts way before 2019, but the point is that it seems to have accelerated recently. And in this essay, I mean, I give a fair amount of detail plus links to other stories about 23 cases of academics targeted for punishment in some way by other academics. And sometimes the punishment doesn't succeed, but 10 of them lost positions. A bunch of them were retractions, a couple of deplatformings, there were some failed threats of punishment. And the attacks usually involve some perceived violation of something having to do with social justice. There were a couple involving violations of beliefs about climate science. I mean, I'm not going to go into any of this in any detail. I have backup slides if you want more detail. One of my favorites is the polar bear story. A woman had the unmitigated gall to say that there was no, you may remember there was the polar bear crisis 5, 6, 7 years ago, that the ice was, the climate change, global warming, ice is all melting, the polar bears threatened. And she said, no, that's like just not happening, lost her position. It was very easy for me to go back into like things having nothing to do with the controversy. What did I find? I found out an essay by the Canadian Geographic and from like 2012 or 14, and then the World Wildlife Fund, I think from 2020. And there are more polar bears now than there were in 2014. So she was right. She lost her position, but whatever. This is the way this stuff works. Okay. I gave up keeping up. It was too much work. There were just too many of these things. I could not keep up. I have a real job. I have a real life. And so, my last entry to this is I'm no longer keeping it up, but the National Association of Scholars has an ongoing list. Now, they don't give a lot of details of 162 of these cancellation attacks on professors. And it's 162 and growing. I mean, I did this last week in preparation for this talk. It was like 140 the last time I had looked at it. So just in case you don't know what a cancellation attack is, I have a blog on that also. And the key element, there's probably a couple of key elements. It's not necessarily all 10 of these things, but you're being denounced, you're not being criticized. This one of the sort of moves in this is, well, everybody's subject to criticism. What are you, against free speech? No, well, it's not being against free speech, but let's be clear, nobody's looking to have a discussion about the validity of your view. They are denouncing and ostracizing you. At least that's an attempt. It's usually by a mob. It involves public shaming and attempts to punish you. I mean, so there's more there. So, but that's what a cancellation attack is. Okay. So far, I've had elite colleges, Harvard and Princeton, basically advocating for intolerance and censorship. And I have these sort of summary lists, and that's the real world. And, I don't think that's dismissible as, it's anecdotes, but, some might want to dismiss it as anecdotes. So where's the data? Okay, well, here's some of the data. Let's do the data thing. So this is also from Kaufman's report. And what what he asked was whether people would support a campaign to oust, that is fire, have them voluntarily resign, whatever it would be, for any of the positions listed at the bottom. It's arguing that diversity is a net negative, that traditional parenthood is better than other forms of parenthood, to restrict immigration, that the colonial empires did more good than bad, and that actually in some domains, women and/or minorities actually have lower performance. So what the green bars show are the proportion of academics. On the left, you have faculty, on the right, graduate students saying they would support a campaign to oust at least one of a faculty member who espoused at least one of those views. So this is no longer criticizing, argument, denouncing. This is now ostracizing, firing, blacklisting. And it's a disturbingly high level among active academic faculty, consistent with some of the other stuff I presented earlier. This seems to be worse among younger liberals and among younger would-be academics. This is data from social psychology. These data are about almost 10 years old at this point. Actually, the data probably are 10 years old. It simply surveyed social psychologists about whether they felt there was a hostile climate towards their beliefs in the field. The numbers are staggering, not just for conservatives, but moderates are feeling it also. So this is the percent saying it's at least somewhat hostile to my environment, to my beliefs. Hardly any liberals say this. And this basic pattern was repeated a few years ago this is the same Honeycutt and Freeberg study of California State College faculty. The correlation between political ideology, identity with perceived hostile environment was 0.3. The more conservative they were, the more they perceived a hostile environment. These are Kaufman's data. I like these. He calls this the iceberg model, sort of tip of the iceberg. It's consistent with the pyramid model. It's another way to look at it. At the bottom, you have like the mildest sources of discomfort. Just somebody saying, I'd be uncomfortable talking about this with someone, saying that you're a Trump supporter or a Brexit supporter. And at the very top, you have threatened with disciplinary action. And at the very top, it's left-wing academics. So the second one, the 23%, is academics who skew right. And so, completely consistent with the pyramid model. Yeah, I mean, the more extreme the nature of the intolerance, the less it happens. But it's also much, much worse for people on the right, for academics on the right, than for those on the left. So I'll leave that up there for a second. So this is what he calls the victim's view. That is, people who say this has happened to them. This is, go there. And right, here we go. This is what he calls the perpetrator's view. And again, so that is the people who are willing to engage in acts of ostracism, punishment, or censorship. And again, it gets more extreme as you go up the iceberg or the pyramid, whatever you want to call it. At the bottom, are people who would say they would discriminate for someone who, believes something that they oppose. And at the top, you have the share who would actually seek to get someone dismissed. So I'll leave that up there. Again, these are the people saying they would do this. They support doing this. Okay, so I'm going to continue. This is also from Inbar and Lammers. This is the 10-year-old study of social psychologists, and they asked their respondents about how much they endorse academic discrimination. would you be reluctant to invite a conservative to a symposium? Would you give a negative review to a paper taking a conservative perspective, negative review of Grant taking a conservative perspective? And would you choose a liberal over a conservative job candidate with equal qualifications? What you see on the right side of the red is what they reported. That's the percent scoring above the midpoint. I asked them for their data, which they graciously provided, because it seems to me that discrimination kind of is not really a justified thing. So I wanted to know how many were scoring above not at all. And no matter how you do it, the numbers are disturbing. I mean, you have 50 to 75% saying, well, yeah, kind of sometimes. And even if you use the scale midpoint as the cutoff, you're having substantial minorities saying, yeah, I'm good. Yeah, let's do this. This was essentially replicated by the Honeycutt and Freeberg study of the California state professors. Again, this is across multiple disciplines. And I didn't ask them for their data, so all I have is what they reported. They reported it like in Barn-Lammers, which is the proportion above the scale midpoint, which is a pretty substantial minority of academics saying, yes, we should discriminate against conservatives in these contexts. And how does this play itself out? Well, what you have here are the percentage of graduate students saying my political views wouldn't fit in academia, and this could make my life difficult. Now, the N for students on the very right is pretty small. I mean, it's 26, so gigantic error bounds around that. But the pattern is nonetheless vividly clear that the further right you go, the more graduate students feel justifiably uncomfortable in academia. Okay. And you might be wondering, well, talking politics is hard for everybody. What's the deal here? Well, it turns out it's actually harder in academia if you are on the right. So what these are this is data from Britain. And the thing is, would you be comfortable talking about basically supporting Brexit with, at work with your colleagues? And if you're a leaver, that is, you support Brexit, academia with its, storied protections of academic freedom has the lowest proportion of people saying, yes, I'd be willing to talk about being on it. And when I lowest, it's less than half of all the other contexts. Charities, factories, hospitals, government. It's like staggeringly low, which this makes sense if what you are surrounded by are intolerant, censorious authoritarians. Then it makes sense. Okay. So what are the costs here? Well, there are the human costs. I mean, if you've ever listened to the rationale behind diversity initiatives, which I think the rationale is a good rationale. There's the conventional sort of demographic-based initiatives in academia are useful, they're necessary. I'm glad they're happening. I'm actively creating some in my own department. So this is not an argument against any of those. But one of the intellectual arguments for those initiatives is we have so many social problems facing the country and the world. We want to be in the business of making maximal use of the human intellectual power to address these problems. Well, I agree with that argument. That's a really good argument. That would also be an argument why we probably don't want to be in the business of alienating half or more of the population from attempting to address these problems, at least in academia. That seems like a really good argument for that. Over and above the human cost, there's the cost to science. And that cost, especially social science, or really any science on politicized topics. By driving the people with these ideas out, you're driving the ideas out of academia, and you're driving them out probably before they have a chance to even be seriously considered. You're driving out one side of the motivated, skeptical vetting of politicized ideas. So we're all motivated, totally by that. Way science, especially science on politicized topics works, you're going to have, people on the right highly motivated to debunk left affirming findings. You're going to have people on the left highly motivated to debunk right affirming findings. I'm in. Let the debunking win. Let's find out what's actually true by subjecting all of this stuff to maximal skepticism. But of course, you can't do that if you've driven half of the spectrum out of the field. Because when you punish people for finding the wrong findings or for suggesting the wrong hypotheses, you not only potentially silence them, like, this is who needs to be harassed by a mob? Are there other things I can do instead of studying some politically controversial topic? I think I'll study shape perception and vision. You're not likely to be denounced by a political mob of left-wing authoritarians if you study shape perception. It's just not likely to happen. But the worst message is not just the individual who is targeted, it's everybody else paying attention. Oh my God, this person got denounced for whatever, finding the wrong thing. Better not to deal with that. I think I'll go do something else. And God knows how many hundreds or thousands of people are taken down when these kinds of mobbing events occur. I think we have seen some of this already. It looks to me like it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think what you can expect is this sort of continued decline in trust and support for academia, and especially academia on politicized topics, among these groups. Now, this is beginning to be a lot of groups now. It's not just conservatives now. It's conservatives, centrists, people who are apolitical but paying attention. I kind of think apolitical people don't want politicized findings. They don't want axe-grinding dogmas masquerading as scholarship, I think. I mean, maybe they do, but I don't think so. Libertarians, you have people whose politics are complex, don't easily map onto left, right, and even non-authoritarian liberals, I'm pretty sure, have begun to object to this state of affairs. That is a lot of people that academia is risking alienating by permitting and enabling and supporting this sort of radicalization. We have a whole separate panel on solutions. I'm not going to preempt their thing, and I actually really look forward to hearing what they have to say. I think in some ways the solutions are really easy, and that is just do things to increase the political diversity and openness in the field. It solves a lot of these problems. It also solves the social, the credibility problem for the wider society. That is, if consensus around some topic is reached by people from across ideological and political divides, then that's going to be very persuasive. That's going to have preemptive credibility with many people in a way that when it's simply coming from the left and far left, it is going to be easy to dismiss, even when it's true, because of the boy who cried wolf problem. But it also it'll deserve more credibility because it'll build in accountability checks on these sorts of biases. Now, but it's not really easy, even though, because that sounds easy, but I see no evidence that academia writ large, there are pockets here and there, but there is absolutely no consensus, and as far as I can tell, not even much interest in taking active, proactive steps to do anything about this. And actually what I see more of are defensive refusals and justifications, refusals to do so, and justifications for the current state of affairs. So this is why I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Okay, so here are the bottom lines, and I'll be done. Academia is massively, massively left skewed, including massive overrepresentation of the extreme left compared to the regular population. Left-wing authoritarianism is alive and well. I don't know whether it has just recently been born in the democratic West or it was always there and mostly left-leaning faculty missed it. I can't tell, but it is live and it is here and it is now. And I think there is ample evidence that this sort of authoritarianism, intolerance, censorship, aggression is a force within academia. It's not the majority force, it's not the dominant force, but it is a force within academia. And I would say overall, these models have fared fairly well. These are not really, easily, it's not like I did a structural equation model and showed the goodness of fit was high. That's not what these were. These are sort of ways of looking at the process. And I think these ways of looking at the process fare fairly well with these data. And God, Lord knows, this is a 40-minute talk. So there's plenty of other data that I haven't presented. So I'm going to end there, and I just want to sort of acknowledge and thank the two students I've worked with that did the bulk of the work on the small piece of this that was original data. There's Akila Kareem, who's a graduate student, and will probably be on the market next year. And Brett Bill, who's an honor student, and I just nominated him for the top award that Rutgers gives, because the thesis he did was just off the charts on this stuff. There's a long list of people at the bottom. I want to particularly acknowledge Tom Costello. He is a late year graduate student who is going to be on the market. Given the political winds of academia, I think he's running into a headwind. But if there ever was a group that might be welcoming towards somebody who's doing the kind of work he's doing, this would be that group. So I mean, everybody there really deserves acknowledgement, but him especially. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. Philip, your response?
Yes. So yeah, I know I enjoyed Lee's comments. I'm naturally a contrarian, so even though I am pretty deeply sympathetic to the arguments that Lee has advanced, and I find the evidence he's presented pretty compelling, I'm going to try to role play a woke inquisitor. So I'm going to start with a simple observation I don't think Lee would find controversial, and it's that speech has always had reputational consequences. It never has been and never will be free. It always occurs within a socio-political set of constraints and ground rules. And I would also, I'm assuming Lee would agree with that, and I'm also going to assume that Lee would agree with me that the construct of authoritarianism is a somewhat problematic one, because it's not just a descriptive, factual, psychological label. It's also a value judgment. And there's sometimes a fine line between authoritarian leadership and authoritative leadership. I think some of the examples that Lee has described, from my point of view, do clearly cross the line into authoritarian. But I think we probably agree that social science is supposed to be a descriptive, explanatory enterprise, not a normative one. So let's leave it at that for now. I think the basic question that Lee is wrestling with is I see it as a political, psychological question, and that is, have the consequences of saying certain things been changing over time? And specifically, has this so-called Overton window of acceptable discourse, has it been shrinking for conservatives to the point where we reach a point of no return in the humanities and the social sciences, and it's now become virtually impossible to be even moderate or certainly conservative and successful. Now, again, I find the evidence Lee has offered that the window has shrunk, and I think that is correct. And I think the rate of shrinkage has probably accelerated over the last 5 years. I don't think Lee has spoken directly to that point, but I think it's certainly my sense from my own personal time series of 42 years in academia that there's been an acceleration of restrictions. But let me ask three basic questions, because I know time is short. One is a boundary condition question for Lee. I totally understand your concerns about the career consequences facing young conservatives, libertarians in the humanities and social sciences. There's certainly evidence of self-censoring of several lines of work. But but how far does your concern for diversity of thought in academia extend? And this is, again, the woke do not represent a different species. they're also human. I suspect that you and I would both roll our eyes at the idea of hiring creationists for an evolutionary biology department, or anti-vaxxers in public health departments, or anti-GMO crop activists in agriculture, or flat earthers in geophysics, apologists for genocide in ethnic studies. So the question is, how prima facie preposterous as a point of view have to become before Lee Jussim will say, we don't need to worry about including these idiots and scoundrels. And isn't that really ultimately a political contest over who exercises power to include or exclude people from the larger conversation? So that's one question. Second question for me is a signal detection question. And that's a kind of a technical term from psychology that I think Lee will get, and it'll become clear in a moment. Why are you more enthusiastic than your colleagues about welcoming conservatives and libertarians into your discipline? One possibility is that it's because you see more merit in conservative perspectives on markets, taxation, inequality, colorblindness, abortion, and you believe the exclusion of conservatives impairs creativity in theory and research. I think you would strongly imply that in your closing remarks about diversity. So from a signal detection point of view, it's a way of saying you see more signal or information value in including conservative perspectives than your colleagues do. Or you might also disagree with your colleagues because you have a different value function or different utility function. And you see the error of falsely rejecting a meritorious conservative candidate as a worse error than the flip side error of accepting a flaky one. So it's kind of a D prime versus beta debate within signal detection theory. I suspect you're going to say both, but I've never seen you wrestle with the question, and I'm curious how you would wrestle with it. The third question, that's my final question really, is I understand your academia activism pipeline model to imply pessimism. It implies a sort of path dependency lock-in. You don't expect things to change anytime soon. The left has pretty firm institutional control of a large number of university departments and indeed universities, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But what, in your view, could change it? And either, of course, in the direction of becoming more oppressive, and I know you're acutely aware that things could become far more oppressive than they are, or becoming less oppressive, markedly less oppressive. I mean, Overton windows of permissible discourse can expand or contract surprisingly fast in response to a variety of factors. Big historical shocks, like wars. Isolationism can go in and out of fashion very fast. Pandemics, technology, crime waves, and tipping point epiphany sorts of events. Never more vivid than with the fall of Ceausescu in Romania in 1990. When people revealing the false consensus of support for the regime. So I guess if I disagree, it may be that I see the current situation as more fluid and more changeable than you do. I think your model, the activism pipeline, I think does imply path dependency lock-in, and I'm not. And I can see why you would argue that, but it would be fun, I think, to make some forecasting reputational bets here about and if we could come up with specific indicators of how oppressive things are, how many people does organizations X say were fired or punished for this or that. And anyway, so I will simply leave my remarks at that point. I think that it's a really strong body of evidence you've amassed. It is a depressing, worrisome situation, but maybe I'm a tad more optimistic than you are.
Thank you very much, Cory.
Okay, I also have slides, so let's see if I can do this. PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, do people see this? Yes. Also, can you see when I move my cursor around? Okay, cool. So I decided to respond to Lee with some brand new data that I'm actually still in the process of collecting, where I sort of broke the tradition of conducting MTurk studies and actually talked to people by interviewing a bunch of academics, not a bunch, 40 so far. These are interviews mostly with psychology professors. I say mostly because there were some from other disciplines, like political science or law, a couple of postdocs. But these were interviews mostly with psychology professors. And I started kind of by talking to people that I knew of, where I sensed I kind of knew where they stood on these issues, to try to recruit a sort of a sample of diverse perspectives, plus people that I had no idea what they thought of these issues. And then I used a technique that I'm terming the adversarial snowball, where I asked people, who is somebody who you think would disagree with you on these issues, who would talk to me? And then I also did some random selection where I just went to psychology faculty pages and just picked names off the screen. Before I get into any of these results, I just want to say that this is a pilot study for a larger survey that I'm doing. It's a very small sample, only 40 professors, and it's not representative of psychology professors on whole. I don't think it's horribly not representative, but it's definitely not fully representative either. Before I get into I'll just click down here. Just some of the demographics for this group of people I talked to, they skewed slightly male. The age range was 28 to 82, mean 44.6, pretty racially and ethnically diverse. And then in terms of ideology, this is one reason I think that they might not be horribly skewed. My range was 2 to 60, 2 being extreme liberal, 60 being very slightly conservative, with a mean of 31. So the mean was about moderately liberal. If psychology professors are a little bit more extremely liberal, then maybe the sample is a few points more to the right than professors are on whole. The first question I asked people was, are there certain topics, research questions, or empirical conclusions that you believe are off limits in your field? Around 83% said yes, 8% said no, and 10% said something like, nothing is off limits, but there are certain topics where you have to be more careful, or they're more sensitive, or you're going to be held to a higher standard if you study these topics because they're sensitive. Oh, sorry, it's weird that I have to click this. Oh, there we go. I then asked people whether they would say that's generally a good thing or a bad thing. And among people who said that there are topics that are off limits, around 73% said that was bad, around 6% said it was good, and around 21% said something like it's both good and bad, or it's neither good and bad, or it just kind of comes with the territory, that's the way it is. Among people who said there were no topics that are off limits, 100% of those handful of people said that it was a good thing. So people are generally think it's bad for topics to be off limits for study in psychology and other related disciplines. I asked people in general, do you wish scholars had more or less freedom to study topics without fear of negative personal or professional consequences, or is it just right? 80% of people said more, 18% said just right. Nobody said less, but I think that might be because I didn't ask the question in a very good way. So self-criticism noted, I'll do better next time. But overall, people seem to think that we should have more academic freedom, that it would be better if scholars had more academic freedom. I asked people what was the most taboo topic in the entire field. And the most common topic people mentioned was race, but there were some other ones as well. And then I asked people the follow-up question, is it the whole topic that's taboo or off limits, or is it a particular conclusion within that topic that's off limits? And if it's a conclusion, what conclusion is off limits? And almost everyone said it was not the topic as a whole, it was a conclusion. And so what I didn't do any formal analysis of these responses. I just created a word cloud of what people said, so you can kind of see what the modal response is to this question. So you can see the conclusion that people perceive to be the most off limits generally regards race differences, especially if those race differences are said to be genetically caused or biologically caused or evolved or innate. A lot of people said if it's anything that could be perceived as blaming the victim. Some people said that it would be off limits to say that any race differences are not the result of discrimination or prejudice. And it's particularly off limits if it regards a sort of important outcome. So things like intelligence or IQ or criminal behavior or professional outcomes and other life outcomes. So this would be the most taboo conclusion a scholar could draw, or the conclusion that would be most off limits for a scholar to draw. I then asked people what the second most taboo topic was, and the modal response here was related to sex and gender. And I again asked people, is it the topic or is it a conclusion? And again, everyone said, not everyone, most people said it was a conclusion, not the topic on whole. And here you see something quite similar, but about sex and gender rather than race, where conclusions are particularly off limits if you're talking about a sex difference and you suggest that it's biologically caused or genetically caused or evolved, and especially if it's related to differences that people care about. So things like for women, it was especially like representation in STEM or professional outcomes. And also people tended to say that it was more off limits or more taboo if you were to suggest that these differences are real and it's like the marginalized group that you're saying is underperforming in that domain. So for if women are less represented in STEM, whereas if you were to provide a biological explanation for why men commit more crime, that wouldn't be as off limits. Okay. So regarding whatever taboo conclusions people produced, so I gave you the modal responses, but it was different for different people. So whatever they said was the most taboo conclusion. I asked them, on a 0 to 100 scale, do you believe that that conclusion might be empirically true? 0 being I'm 100% certain it is untrue, 100 being I'm 100% certain it is true, with 50 meaning both are equally plausible. And I asked people, on a 0 to 100 scale, how often do you keep your views on that topic to yourself and avoid sharing them openly with your peers in the public? 0 being I never self-censor, 100 being I self-censor all the time. And what we see for the most taboo conclusion is a pretty strong relationship, correlation of 0.61, between how likely they think the thing is to be empirically true and how much they self-censor. So among people who think that the taboo conclusion is wrong, they don't self-censor much at all. But among people who start to think it's plausibly true or that it might be true, you see quite a bit of self-censorship. And the reason this could be a problem is that this could skew perceptions of what the consensus is on empirical conclusions in the discipline, where the people who think something isn't true will share their views openly, and the people who think it is won't, and it creates a false sense of consensus surrounding that topic. I actually did not see the same thing for whatever people said was the second most taboo conclusion. There's almost no relationship here between what people believe is true and how much they self-censor. Although you can see that still quite a few people report self-censoring on the topic, but you also see a lot of people saying that they think the taboo conclusion is empirically true. So I'm not entirely sure what to make of this. It could mean that whatever people perceive as the most taboo conclusion is just much more taboo than what they perceive as the second most. And so people are, they're more willing to speak their views on the issue, even if they believe the taboo conclusion is true. Okay, I also asked people on a 0 to 100 scale, when other scholars start a petition or a Twitter campaign to get a paper retracted or get another scholar fired for harmful research, how much do you admire or respect the efforts of those scholars? From 0, maximum contempt, to 100, maximum admiration and respect. And I found that people really dislike these people who are doing these like petitions and Twitter campaigns to get papers retracted and get scholars fired. The modal response was 0 to 10, close to maximum contempt. One person asked if they could give a negative answer. And the most positive responses we saw were basically people on the fence, so like around 50. A number of scholars said they would answer this question differently if it were a different offense. So if a scholar was caught fabricating data or violating their ethics approval, or I think 1 or 2 people also mentioned like having like sexual misconduct with a student, then they might be more supportive. But when the retraction campaign or firing campaign is because of harmful conclusions a scholar drew, people do not like these, at least among the sample that I looked at. Some other themes that emerged were that there were certain intersections with identity. So, non-white scholars felt more free to talk about race than white scholars. Women felt more free to talk about gender and sex than men. With few exceptions, people thought that normal scientific scrutiny should be the only consequence for drawing taboo conclusions. So if a scholar comes to a conclusion that people perceive as harmful, most people think the only right thing is for that person to be scrutinized the same way everyone else is. There were a few exceptions. Some people did say these people should be fired. If they can't be fired because they have tenure, they should be stripped of all of their positions, like in their university or in professional organizations, or they should be called out. But that was very few people, and most people seem to think that just normal scientific scrutiny was the appropriate response. But almost everyone thought that they would suffer more severe consequences. So the most common response was people wouldn't like me, people wouldn't want to work with me, people in my department, wouldn't want to hang out with me. There were some professional consequences, like it would be harder for me to publish, it would be harder for me to get grants, I wouldn't win awards. And then some people did say they thought that they would get fired. One person said they thought they'd get the guillotine, but I think they were kidding about that. But for the most part, the biggest concern was social consequences, and then those did lead into more professional consequences for some people as well. And some people thought that resistance to scientific conclusions is inevitable, that because humans do science and science is occurring within a human context, that people always have and always will resist scientific conclusions. And it's kind of the responsibility of the scientist to not care and have the courage to speak the truth anyway. And that academic freedom isn't really a problem if you compare right now to the rest of human history and you compare the United States to other countries. Academics today have more academic freedom than almost any other academics throughout history. And so we're probably not likely to get more academic freedom. And really what we need to do is be okay with the social ostracization that's going to occur if we want to study these topics and have the, the professional integrity to study these topics anyway. So to kind of tie these findings into what Lee presented, I completely agree with him that academia, and especially the social sciences and humanities, are overrun by the political left, and it looks like it's going to keep moving in that direction in the future. I agree that it seems to me there probably is discrimination against scholars who, I say not left enough, because people that I talk to, even people who are like moderate liberals, they fear more extreme liberals. So like on my 0 to 100 scale, where 0 is extremely liberal, the people who say 15 are afraid of the 5s. So I think there is concern about people, if you're not like the most liberal person, people might not like you. That would obviously deter some people from wanting to be academics, and I think that's unfortunate. But I think it's possible that most academics are still quite reasonable and that they actually do support academic freedom. And I think that it's possible that we have a sort of vocal minority problem where it's a small group of scholars. These are the left-wing authoritarians. These are the people trying to, cancel other scholars and cancel other scholarship. These data are from Eric Kaufman's report, which Lee pulled on in a lot of his slides, which looked at support or opposition to campaigns ousting dissenting academics across a variety of topics. And the little blue bars here are people who support these campaigns. So you can see it's a pretty small percentage of people. The highest you get is for ousting an academic who says that women or minorities have lower performance, which is consistent with the most taboo topics I discovered in my interviews. But even there, you have more people who oppose it than who support it. So I'm not sure that the problem, I'm not sure that what we need to do is get more conservatives into the discipline so much as we need to be a little bit braver in our support for academic freedom, and that everybody needs to be a little bit braver, speak up a little bit more often. When we have people who we know care about these issues and they don't speak about them publicly, get them to be a little bit braver. And if most academics still support the principles of academic freedom, which I'm not 100% sure that they do, but I think that they might, we really just have a collective action problem where individual scholars don't want to pay the price. They don't want to put a target on their back to be the person who defends the principles, but most people do. possibly. and getting more conservatives might not be possible, and especially might not be possible without violating people's autonomy. If conservatives really, they don't like it there because they're not going to get invited to dinner parties, and you can't tell people they have to invite the conservatives to their dinner parties, that maybe everyone just supporting academic freedom more might be a better solution. And I wanted to end just with this quick quote that Phil just told me about this book yesterday, and I did not read the book, but I did read a short summary of the book and included this sentence. When the support of a policy, tradition, or regime is largely contrived, a minor event may activate a bandwagon that generates massive yet unanticipated change. So if I'm right that the majority of academics still want academic freedom and they're just scared into submission by the small minority of people who are really vicious on Twitter, if everyone feels that way, if everyone could just shift a little bit more and support their principles a little bit more, that could create a sort of cascade effect that could create a big difference without trying to fundamentally change the political composition of social scientists. That is all I have.
All right, thank you very much. Lee, do you want to take a little time to respond? And we might go a little over because we have a bunch of questions and I'd like to get to at least a small number of them. But if you'd like to respond, Lee, now would be a good time.
Yeah, okay. So Cory's presentation was great. And Phil asked these trenchant questions. So it's hard, I'm going to try. So I'm not going to do justice to either commentary because it would take too long. That's my first point. I'm going to share on the issue of, this is actually from an entirely different talk, but on the issue of what about nutcase conservatives in academia, I would say the process mostly doesn't work that way. That is, anyone who would go through the mill of graduate school and learning the sort of ground rules for research and the guide rails, get a master's thesis and a doctoral dissertation, it's going to be very difficult, maybe not impossible, but very difficult to be a QAnon conspiracy theorist. Now, actually, QAnon turns out, I could do a whole thing on QAnon, right? I mean, you have Jeffrey Epstein, you have the Catholic priests, you have people in powerful places engaging in pedophilia. You have, there have been, real world conspiracies. So I think QAnon may actually be nutcase, but it's nutcase stuff built on real world events that are too easily dismissed by mostly left-wing academics grinding their own axes. But the main point is that the normal socialization into the intellectual and methodological practices of what constitutes science and social science constitutes a way to filter people proposing nutcase ideas, and therefore doesn't constitute a justification for any discrimination against people who happen to be conservative. So I'm just going to throw that out. Long as they're complying, they're doing research, running experiments, their methods are tight, whatever. So that's just that. I have two more slides if I can find them. On Cory's point about courage, I think that's true, but really difficult. And I think it's difficult because academia is built in a very, in my opinion, a very dysfunctional way. I can't believe I can't find this slide. Maybe I can do it this way. Well, maybe I inadvertently deleted the slide. I can do this. I can wing it. Academia is a social reputational system. That is, especially in the social sciences and humanities, we're not a validity-seeking system. And how do you know this? Everything in one's career hinges on what other people think of you. How do you get published? Referees say it's a good paper. Does that make it a good paper? No, it does not make it a good paper. But somebody says it's a good paper. How do you get grants? Panel says it's a good proposal. How do you get a job? In part by your record, which is all these sort of things, and strong letters from famous people in the field. What is that? Famous people in the field say you're a good person, you're a good scholar. How do you get promoted? External referees. It's this social reputational system. So of course, people are terrified of anything that could damage their reputation. Because if your reputation gets damaged, who is going to hire you? Who, right? I mean, you're at high risk of never being able to work in this town again. So that makes courage very, not impossible, but very, very difficult. That is a steep mountain to climb. And do I have one? Yeah, I think I'll just stop there. That's long enough. I'll just stop there.
All right, let me, if the panelists have questions, they should use the hand raise function. Other than that, I'll go back and forth between panelists and attendees. We have some great questions in the queue here. So this question comes from Sean Stevens, and it's for Cory. The question is, in the Kaufman studies, he used a list of experiments to assess willingness to discriminate. The results indicated that the willingness to discriminate against political outsiders was considerably larger than when faculty was asked about discriminating explicitly. So if we consider that, is it really just a loud and vocal and small minority that's doing the discriminating?
Hi, Sean. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I do think discrimination happens, but I don't know that that individual discrimination that would be happening on a case-by-case basis, like when I get reviews to a paper and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so unfair. I don't think that's contributing the biggest problem. I think what's terrifying people is like the Twitter thing, right? That's what's scaring other people into submission. And this is related to what Lee was just saying too, which is that I think people think their reputations will be damaged more than they really will, because more people support academic freedom than it seems, because people won't say it out loud. Now, I think the discrimination that does happen is a problem, and I don't think that's fair to people, and I especially worry about it with young students who would consider going to the field. I think that's horrible, and that is a problem, but I don't think that's contributing to the terror in the same way the like vicious vocal LWA type people are contributing to the problem. So yeah, I would agree that it's an issue, but maybe not the biggest issue.
Jonathan Marks.
You're still muted.
Thanks to Lee and all the panelists. And I found Lee's presentation persuasive. He amasses a lot of data. But there's one element of it that I want to ask a question about. At some point in the talk, you say, given the situation, who would want to work there, right? So the spiral as conservatives no longer enter academia. And so the problem the percentage of people answering definitely yes or yes to those questions was a little higher among conservatives, whether they were tenured or non-tenured, than it was for their counterparts, their left liberal counterparts. And I'm wondering what you make of that evidence. Why aren't conservatives more miserable in academia?
Well, I know of that evidence, and I don't really, I'm going to speculate because I don't really know. I don't have an evidence-based answer to that. Look, academia is a great gig once you get tenure. it's just a great gig, right? It's like brutally difficult, I mean, getting tenure is a brutal process, right? You're on your neck is on the chopping block the entire time. I don't want to underestimate the stress involved in that. And after you get tenure, there's still lots of sources of stress. But basically, unless you do something like really grossly unethical, you engage in sexual harassment or criminal behavior, you have a job for life. This is like amazing. This doesn't happen in the rest of the world. What's not to like, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on? And I think once you get through, once a conservative or anyone else who might have, there's this discussion, some of this discussion might well apply to women in STEM, to racial and ethnic minorities in the academy, discomfort, ostracism, there's this whole thing there that people have argued is a problem in the academy. But once you say, okay, this is out there, I'm going to deal with it anyway, and then you get through, it's like, I mean, it helps to actually like the intrinsic features of the job, teaching, writing, engaging in research and scholarship. So if you like the intrinsics and you have a job for life, with respect to just, are you happy in the job? Why would you not like it? So it's like a huge main effect of things having nothing to do with the ideology. That'd be my guess, but I don't know.
All right, we have another question in the queue. This one comes from Rachel Ernstoff. She says, when I discuss these issues with others, they often say something like, well, academia is concerned with truth and conservatives aren't. So no wonder there aren't many conservatives in academia. Of course, there's evidence of hostility, but the hostility is against conservative ways of thinking, which are bad for science. So how would you respond to that?
I think I already did, actually. I mean, it's a good question, but my answer is this slide. That is, conservatives in the academy have to follow the same rules as everybody else. And, if they follow the same rules as everybody else, then, maybe what the conservatives think is wrong, but if they're following, let's say Rachel's interlocutors are right. I don't think this is true. I think this is exceedingly unlikely to be true. But on 80% of the hypothetical universe of questions that a social scientist might ask, the answers come out sort of left vindicating. Let's just say that's true. I really doubt that that's true, but let's say it is true. And you have this influx of hypothetical and alternative universe, an influx of conservatives who are trained in science and are trained to hone in on the truth, no matter whose ox is being gored. Well, if they're prioritizing truth over political axe grinding, then they are going to converge on the same conclusions that people on the left converge on. So this problem completely evaporates. It completely evaporates unless we are really bad at teaching methods that allow people to converge on truth. Now, that is a possibility, but that is an indictment of the state of social science if, in fact, that is true. I think I have one more slide that let me stop sharing and make sure that I can share this slide. As far as I can tell, the world, data from the world, does not neatly fall consistently into one side of the spectrum. And the only reason it appears that way in the social sciences, or the main reason, is that the social sciences are so overwhelmingly left. And it doesn't mean the reason, sometimes it may be just a function of the nature of the question that's asked. I mean, if 500 faculty are asking, well, what does right-wing authoritarianism predict? You're gonna have 500 articles on right-wing authoritarian. Right? I mean, and none on left wing. It's going to look like, oh my God, the world is filled with right-wing authoritarianism because the social science is filled with right-wing authoritarianism because that's what people chose to study. That doesn't mean there's, in fact, I didn't present this evidence, but the 3 articles on left-wing authoritarianism, well, 2 of the 3 directly compared it to right-wing authoritarianism, and you get symmetrical patterns. And actually, Cory is a co-author on a meta-analysis showing that bias and judgments on politicized topics, are symmetrical left and right. So I really doubt that this whole, the world is, left vindicated. Anyway, what I have up here is about over the summer, I started working with this sort of big data group out of Princeton that is studying radicalization, online radicalization. And they brought me in part to do stuff on the radicalization of academia. And before I joined them, I'm like, I don't want to join, like some right-wing hack job. I mean, that is not what I'm interested in. If they're, because there's always that risk of that. If you only denounce one side, what is going on, right? Are you driving your own agendas? So in the upper left was a report they published before I came on board. And it exposed these sort of radical right-wing extremist groups, especially the Boogaloo, organizing online to incite, to attack police and incite violence. And in fact, this all but predicted the Capitol riot, which came much later. So I said, this is okay. This group is not just grinding axes against the left. And the three reports starting on the right, the anti-Semitic disinformation, network-enabled anarchy, and the contagion of distrust are all reports that I've been involved with. This group works with a bipartisan group. So there are Democrats and Republicans on this. People have been active in the Republican Party, like attorney generals in states and things like that, who are now also academics. But the anti-Semitic disinformation and the anti-vax report, the ones on the upper right and lower left diagonal, are mostly identifying right-wing extremists, actually. It's not exclusively, but the anti-Semitic disinformation online is like New World Order and globalists and George Soros and all that sort of stuff. And the COVID stuff is the anti-COVID sort of misinformation is also mostly on the right. So those two reports are mostly exposing the dangers of right-wing extremism. But the report on the lower right exposes left-wing extremism. It was this network-enabled anarchy, these sort of extreme, sort of anarcho-socialist networks that were organizing online to both orchestrate, to incite, orchestrate, and coordinate some of the most violent protests in Portland and Seattle over the summer. So this is my way of communicating to at least everybody who is here that, there's extremists on the right and the left. They're both important. It's really important to understand what, if we want to maintain a reasonably functioning liberal democracy, we want to understand that. But the bigger point is that, as far as I can tell, there's just no reason to believe that data more consistently vindicates left-wing narratives than right-wing narratives. So your interlocutors, Rachel, are wrong.
Thank you, Lee. Just in passing, I think there was another slide of yours that had some bearing on this. I was pleased to find out that conservatives are not so underrepresented in the hard sciences like physics and mathematics and engineering. And I hope there are no sociologists in the room or anthropologists, but I suspect that physics is much more intellectually demanding than many of the humanities and social sciences. All right, one more question I think we have time for. This is a question after my own heart. Eric Kaufman asks, he says, speech codes and PC are now over 30 years old. Younger academics and PhDs are more intolerant by far. Why would we expect things to get better?
I don't, so I'm going to hand that over to Phil, who does.
If you're asking me to make a forecast, I think the current situation we find ourselves in is, if we had a time series that captured a pure measure, a platonically pure measure of academic intolerance, authoritarianism, I think we would see a blip around between 2015 and 2020. And my expectation would be some form of mean reversion over the next 5 to 10 years, just purely on statistical grounds. Now, I also think, per Cory's comment about preference falsification and Timur Quran, I think that support for extreme censoriousness is thin. I think it gets old fast, and I'm going to expect some fatigue. not a falsifiable forecast, but it's my general expectation. I'd be glad to work out a more resolvable series of forecasts with Lee.
So on
So
that, oh, sorry.
let me,
go ahead.
yeah, well, this will be short. So I did actually recently post on Twitter a falsifiable prediction, and that was that at least one of the major journals would post as part of its journal review policy that articles on certain controversial topics would have to be vetted by activist groups, not just scientists, activist groups. So if you do something on transgender development and identity, it would have to be vetted by a transgender activist group. If you did something on indigenous practices, it would have to be vetted by some indigenous activist group. Not so. Now that's a prediction. And my prediction was that it would happen this year. So that is absolutely a falsifiable prediction. To me, it's sort of like the pyramid model. It would be the very top of the, all I need is one for it to happen. If it happens, to me, it conveys the possibility that it's way, way worse down below.
Right, well, I think
that has already happened. I will email you later.
Yeah, some journals have that. But my expectation is that this is going to be a more transitory phenomenon. And, we're looking at up to 2025 or 2030. But right.
So
fair enough.
On that sunny and optimistic note, let's pause for lunch and we will reconvene in about 50 minutes for the next panel. So thanks, everyone.